Well, thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here with you guys today, and a great pleasure to be down in Australia. I've come down here many times over the years, and it's always great to be here. I was a guest of ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, down in Canberra for the last couple of weeks, and that's been a lot of good roundtables discussions with the government and other officials, so I really appreciate that. What I want to do today, in just some brief remarks, because I want to leave time for interaction and questions. I always think that's a bit more interesting, is talk a little bit about my perception of how the threats changed over the years, and a little bit of how we've done this and some of the things that we're now looking at to combat the threat between countries, but also law enforcement and others. And the title of the talk, I guess, is From Robin Hood to Blofeld. Part of the reason for that is I'm a movie aficionado. So my old office at the State Department, so I was at the end of my government career. I've now left the tepid embrace of the federal government now. I'm out of the federal government, but I had movie posters. I try to make my office unique for a State Department foreign policy sort of office, diplomatic office. So I had movie posters where hackers or computers were the main characters. So I had about 30 of them on the walls, some small, some large. My favorite one was a movie called Colossus, the Forbin Project from 1970, the first movie where computers took over the world. So if you've never seen this, it's hard to find. It's a kind of a cult movie. The U.S. builds Colossus in a mountain to control its nuclear arsenal, take them out of the middle, have perfect deterrence. The Russians, then the Soviets, stole the information and they built Guardian, their version, in the Urals. And the two computers talked to each other and decided to protect humankind from themselves. They take away all civil liberties and take over the world. So that was 70. That was, 14 years before War Games, many years before Terminator. It's a great movie. So I had that and many other movies. But there was also, a good James Bond movie. Skyfall was all about hackers and computers. Some of these movies are good. Some of them are really terrible, too. Some of them are just really, really bad. But they're all interesting, and they're almost all dystopian, too. So hopefully we won't end up in a dystopian world, but in a more positive vision. But the other thing I think that the title is meant to exhibit is just this idea of where the threats are. Now, I started my federal career as a prosecutor doing some of the first cybercrime cases in the 80s and 90s in the U.S., including Kevin Mitnick. So I want to talk about that a bit. I'm a recovering lawyer. I often say I'm once a lawyer. I think you're always a lawyer, though. I often use when I'm talking to groups like this, just to break the ice, the tradition is to tell a joke, and obviously to tell a lawyer joke. But in my long career, I've learned that the problem with telling lawyer jokes is that lawyers don't think they're funny, and non-lawyers don't think they're jokes. So I will dispense with that for this year. I'll tell another joke at the end. So let me move on to the threat a little bit. And Mitnick was, I think, a really interesting case because this is back. Kevin Mitnick had already been prosecuted for cybercrime, for hacking into Digital Equipment Corporation, doing a number of other things. While he was on probation for that, he hacked into computers really around the world. And this is, before there was really the World Wide Web. Certainly the internet was there. But he hacked into companies around the world. He stole their source code, their in-development source code. He claimed that he didn't mean to profit off this. He was just using it for his own intellectual curiosity. Of course, that turned out not to be true. There was a lot of things where he was doing damage to these various companies over time. And there were literally he ended up pleading on the eve of trial. There were literally about 40 different companies around the world that he hit. And he used basically social engineering. He was a good con man. He would call up companies. He'd ask for credentials to get into their system. They gave it to him because he just sounded like he knew what he was talking about. He'd call up employees, and he would learn a lot about them through dumpster diving, as they say, just like going and finding out personal information, which back then was a lot harder than it is now. I mean, now you can get information about people really easily. But he'd pretend to be an employee or pretend to be the system administrator of a company, and people would just give them their information, including information that was pretty secure, like RSA has a token that just changes all the time. He would have them read the token over the phone to them, and they did. So this is always a problem that often the people are the weakest link. But he was very, very adept at doing this, and he caused over 2.5 years when he was on the run, and he was a fugitive during that time. Lots of damage all around the world. We almost caught up with him a couple times. We finally caught up with him in North Carolina, and the FBI arrested him there. And he got prosecuted. He did 5 years in jail. He did 3 years of what we call supervised release, which means you have conditions that apply to you, and if you break those conditions, you go back to jail. One of the conditions was he wasn't even allowed to use a computer during those 3 years because he had not shown an ability to control himself before that. And now he's a consultant making lots of money around the world. But the funny thing was, years later, there's a big cyber security conference called RSA. I know there's an RSA person in the audience that literally draws like tens of thousands of people every year in San Francisco. And I was on a panel with him called Foxes in the Henhouse. Should you hire an ex-hacker to be your security consultant? And so it was me, him, a defense attorney, a media, someone from U.S. News and World Report who was moderating, someone who was a security person for Hewlett Packard. And I said, look, I believe in rehabilitation. Rehabilitation can work. But if you're a publicly traded company, or even if you're not, why would you take the risk? You have someone who's demonstrated they're not trustworthy. Why would you give them the keys to the kingdom? Or maybe you could do penetration testing, as they say, have someone from the outside trying to get in. But even there, you had to put a lot of controls on. And Mitnick said, well, it's like hiring hiring a recovering addict to work in a methadone clinic, to get people off of heroin. And I said, no, it's more like hiring a current addict to be your pharmacist. And so, that was one of the early cases, and there was some debate, and it says Robin Hood. There were a lot of people who thought he was being victimized. There was a small plane flying over the courthouse that said "Free Kevin." There was a whole movement that thought he was being persecuted, even though he ended up pleading guilty. And then you moved on from there to cases where I think people really understood what some of the harm was. We had another case I did was one of the first internet stock manipulation cases, and it was these folks who had a fake web page, a Bloomberg web page, and had nothing to do with this, fake Bloomberg web page that had, if you hit the links on the side, it would take you to the real Bloomberg page. But the story it reported was false. It said this company named Paragon was being bought for $3.5 billion, and the stock went way up on NASDAQ. Jim Cramer, the famous stock TV personality, lost money in this because it went up, and then it went down when it was turned out to be completely false, and people were generating buzz about it. And we tracked that person down too, but it was one of these wake-up moments where people say, this could actually affect me. And then, we've gone from that to much more damaging things that have happened in the last number of years. So we had, for instance, the North Korea attack on Sony Pictures, the intrusions into our Office of Personal Management and theft of a lot of information, personnel and other information. You've had major data breaches that everyone's read about, and the U.S. Target and Equifax. I'm sure there have been some down here as well. And I think that the difference is people stopped treating this as a Robin Hood moment and more as a moment that they understood this could actually affect them. And the same was true, I think, with businesses too. And this is not perfect, but you used to go into, in the government, go in to see a minister, or in our system, a cabinet secretary, or you'd go into a business and talk to the CEO or anyone really in the C-suite about cyber, and their eyes would roll back in the back of their heads, and they just didn't want to, this is technical, I don't understand it, you guys go deal with it. And it's changed, certainly in the US, and I think in Australia it's changed, so increasingly people understand this is a core issue of our national security, it's a core issue of our economic security, it's a core issue of human rights, and ultimately of foreign policy, which I did at the end of my federal career, which I'll talk about at the end. And that's an important transformation. And increasingly in the boardrooms, people are beginning to get this. Now, I will say we're not nearly as far as we need to be. I think that people still look at this as this bright, shiny object, as this boutique issue. I think the financial industry and I think the communications industry, I think in their boardrooms, their CEOs generally get this. They may not know what to do about it. They may not know how to actually assess the risk and how it fits in with the larger enterprise. I think a lot of other companies, that's not true. And so we need to really make progress and not treat this as this boutique issue, but one that's really integrated into all that we're doing. And one of the examples I have of that is a threat that both Australia and the US faced, which was the widespread intellectual property and trade secret theft by China. And this is a big deal in the US, it's a big deal here, it's a big deal in Germany and other places. But if it was being treated just as a cyber issue, I don't think we would ever have made any progress. It's when President Obama, for us, decided it was not just a cyber issue, but a national security and economic issue. And he made the decision to raise it with President Xi every single time he saw him over a 2-year period, so not just a fleeting thing. And he also said they're willing to take risks and friction in the overall relationship with China. China is a complex relationship for us, it is for you. And there's lots of connections, but this was such a big deal because it was really our economic well-being in the future. If these trade secrets are being stolen and used, it undermines our economy. That pressure, I think, over time really made a difference. And so we need to do that more generally with this issue. We need to do it when we're fighting cybercrime. I know we have some folks doing that here. We need to do it in companies. We need to do it in government. I think that's really important. I want to just talk a few minutes about some of the other things we've done. I think one of the ways we're combating these threats is actually calling out some of the state actors and other actors. Our Director of National Intelligence every year has a threat assessment that comes out, a public threat assessment. And cyber has been at the top of that threat assessment for the last 3 cycles, actually 5, where it's been either 1 or 2. The major actors, the major threats have been nation states, China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. That hasn't changed. Russia and China being more capable, North Korea and Iran catching up. They've listed transnational organized criminal groups who are doing this. We've always had transnational organized criminal groups, but they're really focused on cyber. And then you have the lone gunmen and other hackers who are out there operating separately. So you have a range of different threats and threat profiles. A new threat we didn't really see coming was the Russian interference with our election. I mean, I think the cyber people were really focused on things like taking down infrastructure. We're all worried about a big infrastructure attack where you're going to take down the power grid or the financial system, or theft of information, but we weren't focused on this hybrid attack that, if you undermine the democracy, it's as big a deal if you take down the electrical grid, frankly. It really undermines your entire country. I don't think we were ready for that. And then, what I've seen recently, especially, is we put more resources into this, which is great. We've had high-level leadership, which is great, and certainly in Australia, you see the formation of the growth of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. There's a lot being done in the various states. It's a priority for your Prime Minister, which is important, and others in government, on both out of government and in government, and that's important too. But one of the things we've seen recently is actually calling out some of these countries who are doing this. So just last week, the US, Australia, Denmark, Estonia, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK called out Russia for being responsible for what's called the NotPetya attack. This was a ransomware worm. Ransomware, if you don't know, it's basically a worm that would encrypt your system and then ask you for money. But in some of these cases, they didn't really care about the money. They just wanted to make your system unavailable. And it caused tens of millions of dollars to Maersk, which is a big shipping concern out of Denmark that operates worldwide, and other damage too. And so that was a big deal, saying it was Russia. There was something called the WannaCry worm that was a few months before that actually brought the national health system in the UK to its knees, and we attributed that to North Korea. And I think that's really important. I think getting in the habit of doing that and also finding the tools to go after those bad actors is important. I think what we've done a terrible job of doing is actually imposing costs and consequences on them. In both those cases, we've said costs are coming, which is great, but we need to do it. We need to follow through. On nation states, we need to do it. In cybercrime for a long time, the key thing to deter cybercrime, and we need to do a lot more there too, it's still seen as often a costless enterprise, is to go after people, to prosecute them, to bring them to justice, to put them in jail. And one of the things I think is the most effective ways to do that is to do undercover operations, get in these organizations and blow them up from the inside. There's a lot of things being done in the US and Australia to try to aggregate this data, to get a better idea of what's out there, to pool resources. These are always international cases. If I'm a smart hacker, I'm going to route my communications, my attacks through several different countries to evade detection. And so you need international cooperation more than anything else. And that's really part of what I was doing in my last job, was building that international cooperation, working with governments around the world, trying to get them to focus on these issues. We had a lot of dialogues with countries, and we did all of government dialogues, so they had to bring all their different agencies, so you wouldn't have these stovepipes of excellence I often talk about, where people were just locked in their own perspective. So they bring their law enforcement, their defense, their homeland security, their commerce and economic agencies all together, and I thought that was important. We've been pushing a framework of cyber stability, saying that things like international law apply in cyberspace. Is not a free fire zone, that there are norms of behavior, things that states shouldn't do. Don't attack the critical infrastructure of another state if you're not at war. If you're at war, there are different rules that apply. Trying to build more trust and cooperation between states, and also increasing our ability to do collective response. So the one, in this new role, and it was mentioned, we were the first office in the world, but then there were 25, including Russia and China too, who now have these cyber offices, which is important because it really is a policy issue. We also did operational response. So when Iran was attacking our financial institution websites, and there was what's called a denial of service attack. So hundreds of thousands of compromised computers all over the world were basically pinging financial institution websites in the US, so you couldn't get to them. They were unavailable. You couldn't reach them. And that was a persistent problem. It wasn't the end of the world. It wasn't like they were getting into the back rooms of these financial institutions and changing the data so that they couldn't operate. But it was really causing the problems. They couldn't, customers couldn't interact with them, and it was a problem. So what we did is we considered a lot of different things as a country to respond to this. Technical responses. We considered law enforcement responses. We considered, how we would actually get around this problem. But the most effective tool was we did something called a diplomatic démarche, which before I went to the State Department, I thought démarche, it just sounds like an angry word, doesn't it? Like I'm going to démarche someone. But in fact, it was, you have a friendly démarche. It's just, please help me. And so we went to 20 countries around the world where these bots were concentrated and said, look, we need your help. Do whatever you can to mitigate this, to take them out. You have different authorities. You have different law enforcement authorities. You have different methods of dealing with your ISPs. Germany was a place where a lot of these were, and that was very, very effective, and that it worked, and it also created this environment that if you help us, we'll help you, and more the collective response we need. So I think we made a lot of progress. I think we have a huge way to go. I mean, I've seen this over a number of years now. I don't think it's getting necessarily better in terms of the threat. I think it's getting harder, and the threats are getting more sophisticated. I will end with my other lawyer joke before we go to the questions, which is, it was a lawyer joke, but I made it a hacker joke now. So a hacker is walking down the beach. He finds a lamp and rubs it, and predictably enough, a genie comes out. And the hacker says, oh, it's a genie. And the genie says, well, you get 3 wishes, obviously. But because you're a hacker, there's some strings attached. Everything you wish for, every other hacker gets twice as much of. So his first wish is he wants a million Bitcoin. He gets 1 million Bitcoin, every other hacker gets 2 million Bitcoins. And, hackers are kind of competitive people, it just kind of annoys him. And so he says, I want a big, giant supercomputer as his second wish. He gets that, and every other hacker gets that, and Watson from IBM. And again, it just really irks him. And the genie says, hurry up, what's your third wish? I need to get back in the bottle and watch Larry Hagman and I Dream of Jeannie reruns. What do you want? And the hacker pauses and thinks about it and says, I'd like to donate a kidney. So the moral of that joke is that, and this really has what I've seen, is that the sophistication of these attacks and intrusions have gotten greater over the years. The list of different threat actors from nation states to criminals increases. A lot of the criminal groups are not that far behind the nation states in terms of sophistication. These are very hard cases to go after, but if we don't have consequences for these actors, criminal consequences for nation states, it's just going to get worse. And of course, we all have to band together, private sector and government, to actually make sure we're doing everything to harden the targets and do the best security we can. So with that, I'll stop and we'll go to questions. If you pay off the people who are blackmailing you, they don't necessarily go away. So everything you're completely right about the second order effects, that if you pay them, they're going to come after others, and that's not going to necessarily be something you factor in. It's a larger societal cost. But even you as a victim, you've indicated that you're willing to pay the money, you're willing to do this, and so they're going to hit you again. So you're not really creating the incentive you want to. Now, Obviously, the answer to that is to take all the precautions so they can't do that. A lot of time it's just patching systems so that you don't have those vulnerabilities, and that basic hygiene is a big part of it. But look, I hope I'm never in that position of making that decision.
You touched on WannaCry, right? And we have this challenge in my mind of corporate memory, or even citizen memory. That this was an event that a cyber incident traversed cyber boundaries into the physical world, brought down the UK medical system, shut down hospitals. There were examples of hospitals where 1,700 computers in one hospital were infected within 7 minutes. And of course, we all saw that. Australia missed the bullet. But it's almost like memory's now been lost of that. And therefore, by the time we take action, memory of events been lost, little happens. How do you interpret that challenge, and how do we actually take action?
So it's a big challenge. I mean, just for folks in the audience, especially if you're the CISOs or others, how many of you would say that your upper management still cares about that incident or remembers it even happened? So that's pretty bad. So it's almost no one, right? And when you do the attribution, and there are challenges of doing attribution, you do it 6 months after the fact, people have forgotten by that point. And I think this has happened again and again and again in this space, that even though you read the papers and some horrible thing has happened, the memory of the public is very short about it. The memory of business has gotten a little better because they start worrying about risk and regulation and other things, but that's still not perfect. And people have to think about this as a larger risk management issue. It's not just these big episodic things. And we have to do a better job of education, but also policy where we're going after this, and not just focus on the bright, shiny ball of whatever bad thing has happened. One of the problems I have is, I'm glad we did the attribution, not Petya. I'm glad we did the attribution collectively of the WannaCry worm. But in both cases we said, and bad things are going to happen now. Consequences are going to happen. Great, but you actually have to follow through, because if you don't follow through, the people who are the bad actors, it just creates a norm of inaction, a norm of this is okay. I think they will follow through, but if it's going to be 6 months later, my advice is wait 7 months and just do it with the consequences. And actually that gets you, I think, more attention than just saying it's them. Yes. Because, frankly, calling out Russia is not going to dissuade them. Calling out North Korea is not going to change their mind. You have to go beyond that. So, I don't think we're going to have a full-out cyber war. People throw that term around a lot, and I don't think that's really likely. I think you'll have cyber tools used in traditional conflicts, and I worry about that. But I do think you see nation states testing their capabilities and testing the boundaries. So the attack on the Ukrainian power grid, which they were able to reset just because they still had the physical controls downstairs, but let's say they didn't have it, then they would have really had a huge problem. I think you're going to see more of that. You have to look at the actors and see what their motivations are. Do they have a motivation to be disruptive? So, China, for instance, I think has a motivation to take information. They don't have a motivation really to disrupt, us or you. But let's say some geopolitical thing happens around the South China Sea or something, then that might change very quickly. And I think we have to be worried about that. I think criminal groups are getting ever more sophisticated now. They want money at the end of the day. So they're not trying to destroy your business unless they're trying to hold it hostage to get money. Their end result is not to put you out of business. Their end result is to get as much money out of you as they can, or just from whatever criminal scheme they're in. But I think we're going to continue to see that rise too. I also worry about some of the new technologies, the Internet of Things, which everyone talks about, is a big deal. But these are commodities. People don't build security in. It's like when we were talking about the smart grid several years ago. Criminals are smart, and nation states are smart at taking advantage of this. And you can imagine connected health devices or self-driving cars or other things that create a much larger vulnerability surface. You have new technologies like 5G, and everything's going to ride on the back of that. What do vulnerabilities in that mean? So I'm not optimistic in terms of the threat landscape. I'm a little more optimistic, even as a recovering lawyer and prosecutor, on that. I think we are focusing on it more. I think we're doing more stuff there. I think more countries are focusing on it. I think we've been doing more outreach. But my worry there is it can't be episodic. We did a cybersecurity strategy in 2003. The U.S. did. It's a good document, actually. And it became shelfware by 2004 because people weren't ready for it at the time. People weren't really attuned to these issues. And so if you lose the bubble, if it's a hot issue now in the boardroom and at the leader level, and they move on to something else and don't really keep the focus on this, you're not going to make the progress you need. And I worry about that a little. So Hopefully that won't happen. Look, I think there are two types of activities of criminal groups. One is the ones who are using computer systems to do ransomware and other things, so really attacking computer systems. But a lot of them are just doing traditional crime. It's like new wine or old wine in new bottles, basically. It's using the technology, but just doing all the things they did before, money laundering and all the other things. But it's harder to trace them online, and they take advantage of that. And sometimes there are nation states that use criminal groups as proxies too, which I think is a problem. When you have new technologies like cryptocurrencies and others, there's a lot of promise. I mean, we can't be standing in the way of progress and innovation if the security community is seen as that. This is the tussle I saw in the beginning of the White House, is the economic people and the security people thought each other were crazy. So you really have to work and say that security is helping the economic innovation in the long run. So you're not trying to say, look, those are necessarily bad. But you really do have to think about how you trace that, how you're going to go after them. Because if you don't, you're not going to be able to follow the money path. You're not going to be able to go to these criminals. I mean, that's one of the traditional, if people think you follow the digital footprints alone, that's part of it. But again, smart criminals can obfuscate what they do. If you don't have that money path, it's going to be really hard to do these cases. So I do think we have to have a hard look at how you regulate that, what you do. We've had non-cryptocurrency, digital currencies in the past. There's been lots of marketplaces in the past. Some have thrived and become more regulated and mainstream. Some were like havens of criminal groups and been shut down. So you really have to figure out how to do that.
Say a few more words about that balance between an open internet. And there's so many businesses in this room that have benefited from the innovation that the digital world allows. At the same time, we're trying to secure the internet so that we get that promise of what the internet. How do we manage that balance?
So I think democratic societies do that pretty well. I mean, I think when we talk about cybersecurity, we're not trying to control the information. We're not trying to control the content or information, except for things like child pornography or IP theft. And mostly, democratic societies talk about security and they talk about openness together. I mean, they don't divide them. Our international strategy, your international strategy, came out of your Foreign Affairs Office last year. Really puts those together. We need to have both openness and security together. Now, the problem is other regimes who are more repressive use security as a wedge to actually control information. Russia uses the term information security and not cybersecurity. And the reason they use that is not as the technical term the industry uses, but they mean information security because information itself they think is destabilizing, that it is a weapon, and they need to control it. China feels the same way with the Great Firewall. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal just 2 days ago about China not just trying to restrain content on their own in their own territory, which they've done for a long time, but actually reaching out and doing things in other countries, and that's of a concern too. But then you have a lot of the countries in the middle who are trying to figure out what to do in this, and they like stability, but they also want economic growth. And we have to work, us, both industry and governments, work with them so they adopt a view where they're not using security just as a proxy to go after content, to go after dissent, to go after that. It's a big challenge. I mean, I think there's something called the Freedom House report on internet freedom around the world, and every year it goes down. The index is worse, and that's not a good trend. A list of controls, basic things that if you do these, you will raise the bar significantly. You will harden your target significantly. I think Australia, as I understand, has the basic 4 and other things they do. So I mean, those are really foundational things, and really driving that so it's done. But I think part of that is if you're a business, is not being the CISO or the CIO kind of whistling in the wind and trying to get that done, but it's actually getting the rest of the board to understand that this is a critical issue, and this will help them stem the tide of those problems later on. So that's part of it. That 20 or whatever the percent is of dedicated nation states are still going to breach your system if they really, really want to. But if you get rid of that platform of 80%, frankly, nation states use those vulnerabilities too, because why use your best tools if you can just use something that is a pedestrian? That's where the government can help you with those threats, those really sophisticated threats. You can use the intelligence apparatus, the other apparatus and the cooperative apparatus to really help deal with those. But not enough is being done to reach that level yet.
The Australian government has recently passed legislation that means that if data is breached, personal data is breached, we now need to publicly disclose that to the people that we lost their data for. It in many ways mirrors what the US has had in place for some time. What does that mean for cybersecurity, and how should businesses be thinking about this?
So I tend to think it ultimately is good for a couple of different reasons. We still do not have a national data breach law in the U.S. We have 50, I think it's now 50, it used to be 48. I think every single state has their own data breach law. That's crazy if you're a business. I mean, to live with 50 different ones. So what they end up doing, businesses will say, what's the most strict one? Because we operate in every state, or could. We'll follow that one, and that's it. And so we do need to get a national one, I think. So it's important to have it. What I saw as a change with the California one, which was the first one, was when that happened, I mentioned it was a hard time getting businesses, even when they were victimized, to come forward to law enforcement or to the CERTs, the Computer Emergency Response Team, and said we were hit. But if they have to disclose it, then they do come forward, right? Then they will do it. If there's liability for not disclosing it, that makes sense. And the California one had an interesting thing. I'm not sure the Australian, I don't know all the details of the Australian one, but the California one would give a safe harbor. You didn't have to notify your customers for, I think it was a 60 or 90-day period of time, if you reported it to law enforcement and they were doing an investigation to follow it up. So, and the reason for that makes sense, right? So if you're notifying all your customers, you're also notifying the adversary that you know that what they did. And so you want to have that ability to maybe even get that data back or stop the bleeding that law enforcement can offer. So I don't know if that's in your bill or not. I think that's been very useful. So I think you're going to get more reporting. I just think you're going to get more, the government's going to be more aware of these things. People are going to stop treating, there's a lot more business can do to prevent data breaches. When I was in Los Angeles, it's the bank robbery capital of the world. There were bank robberies every day. People understood them. They still put their money in banks. Now, they were insured and other things. I think you have to get away from this idea that it's a binary thing. Either it's complete security or there's no security. I think we have to get used to the risks are out there, and that will also drive people to take, if you have to disclose the breaches, to take more precautions that will drive businesses to do more to protect that data. So I think overall, that creates a good incentive structure. It also helps law enforcement and the CERTs and others in government know what's actually going on in the world. The EU has gone a little further. So in the Network Information Security Directive in the EU, they have a data breach law, but it goes beyond just personally identifiable information. And so that's like major events. And a lot is just where you draw the thresholds, too, and how long you have. Singapore has done one recently that's a very strict, I think you were saying last night, it's like a 4-hour.
So our one's up to 30 days, which still is not long if you're trying to understand what's happening.
4 hours is really short. So I think there are a number of ones coming out here, but ultimately I think if it's administered and implemented in the right way, it can be very helpful.
And some of the commentary I've said about, obviously the learnings out of the US is, ultimately what disclosure really impacts business is it puts focus around the business's brand reputation.
Yeah, exactly.
Which
is why they don't usually want to report it to law enforcement because they're worried about that. But if they if they have to do this as part of the disclosure, it makes it more of a regular process, and they will take more precautions.
So if boards aren't thinking about this, then obviously it becomes an issue. And I should say the mandatory data breach is both in the cyber world as well as the physical world. Yeah. One or two more questions from the floor, please.
I mean, I think the more, so it depends on what industry you're in, but as the Securities and Exchange Commission is looking at saying for major events, this could be a disclosable incident for publicly traded companies. If you're looking for regulated industries like the financial sector, who their regulators are saying, if you have these events, it will be part of your review that they do. What that means is they have to really address that whole risk. It can't be just what they're doing. They have to look at what their contractors are doing too. There's no perfect thing for that because there hasn't really been a standard of care for cyber so far, and that's the reason you don't see a lot of lawsuits. I mean, I was an ex-lawyer, and lawyers are very litigious, and you haven't seen that because no one really knows what that standard of care is. So when you're contracting with a subcontractor, there's no requirement now that you build in that contract requirements about cybersecurity. They probably should be, frankly. And if you're looking at this as a risk management matter, you should be doing that. We had that problem, even in the government in the U.S., even with the military. We were contracting with lots of people, and we weren't building into those contracts, cybersecurity thing. And that's changed. That was one of the changes over the last 5 years. And I will tell you, that's like turning an aircraft carrier on a dime. It's changing the procurement laws for government is insanely hard. But we were doing that. And I think companies have to start thinking about that, but they'll only start thinking about it because it's going to cost them, right? The contractor will charge more if there's a risk to their businesses if they don't do it. And I think that has to be the driver. And maybe with these data breach laws and with the increased attention by government, that will happen. That's a tough question for everyone, and there's no real easy answers. I think we've been worried about this for many, many years in the law enforcement community. The good thing for many years is that people were stupid and they didn't actually, you always love stupid criminals. I had a bank robbery case when I started as a prosecutor. The guy wore a mask and, tried to disguise his identity. But he worked as a janitor at the building next door and he left his name tag on, which was not a good idea. So stupid criminals are great. But for years we were worried about the museum, and they just weren't using it. But now that it's pervasive and it's automatic, criminals are, and you see this with smart criminals, especially terrorists and others. So there's clearly a law enforcement need to get that data, especially in very high-end, difficult, terrorism and other cases where loss of life could result. At the same time, I think the network security community will tell you, and I agree with this too, that encryption is actually core to network security. And I think this is a bit of a cop-out, but what we've been doing is trying to work with industry to figure out what you can do about this. I don't think there's one size that fits all. You can think about, for encryption on a device, some complex escrowing scheme where different people have different parts of a key. That's very complex. I mean, that might work technically, but that's also very complex in terms of money and policy and transportability, because you're not just going to be in one country either. I wish, if I had the solution to that, I'd be a multimillionaire. I really don't. I mean, it is a real hard tension, and I think what you'll see, this is going to keep boiling up. Every time there's a major incident and there's a cell phone or there's a communication app that can't be accessed, that causes problems. On the other hand, you also have repressive regimes who don't like encryption because they are trying to monitor and repress their citizens, and that's a problem too. So you can't just look at it in one channel. There has to be a big debate about it. I know there is in Australia. There continues to be in the U.S. And we haven't found a solution yet.
Yeah, it's a challenging space, and I think you can't go to the two boundary points. White House, what's happening, Chris?
So I think the good thing is, and I'll stay in the cyber realm, because otherwise there are some really good people at the White House. The assistant of the president for counterterrorism and homeland security and cyber is someone who really cares about cyber. The new Homeland Security head, Kirstjen Nielsen, worked on cyber issues during the Bush administration, so she cares about this. That's good. You have Mattis, who cares about these issues over at Defense. My old boss, Tillerson, I think really doesn't really get this very much. I don't think he's made it a priority yet. We'll see what happens. You have, he's a CEO. I think he treats it as a cost center. It's like a lot of the people in this room have seen. Sometimes CEOs just don't grok this. But and you also have Rob Joyce, who's the cybersecurity coordinator, who was at NSA. He did both defense and offense in his old role, so he really understands, and he can call bullshit on things if they're people propose solutions that are not really good. So you have good people. You had a cybersecurity executive order that came out 5 months into the administration that commissioned a whole bunch of reports. That's good. But the problem is if you don't have attention at the leadership level. And my worry is this has always been a bipartisan issue, but because of the Russia issue and the kind of political overlay to that, it's not as bipartisan an issue as it was. I mean, especially on that topic. I testified before one of the House committees in our legislature a few weeks ago, and generally the questions were very bipartisan. On Russia, they were a little less so. And when the president, when you mention cyber to the president, I think he codes that as Russia, and he doesn't want to hear about it. So I think it does make a difference. If you have a leader who is raising this with his counterparts all the time and say, I want to talk about this issue. When you had Obama raising it with Xi and said, this is an important issue, that's huge. That's really, really important. Yeah, a lot can be done under the radar below that, but if you don't have that, I just worry about the priority and whether that will be seen as a priority in the U.S. And our adversaries will be quick to jump in and fill that gap. And our allies, I think, are left, they want to work with us and have that leadership. So I think there are good people there. I certainly hope this stays a priority, but I am concerned.
Okay, on that note, please thank Chris.